Good morning, everyone. My name is Latoya Swaby Anderson, National Program Officer for Education in the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar series being hosted by UNESCO and CARICOM with response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar is entitled Inclusion, making sure that there is special provision. This webinar is focused on making sure that there is special provision and consideration for students who are impacted by the COVID-19 and who are, based on their experiences and based on their situation, deemed as persons with special needs and varying abilities. I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. We're looking forward to what will be a truly interesting webinar. We want to make sure too that the students and adolescents with learning needs and disabilities within the Caribbean are given the experiences and given the support that is needed to ensure that they are experiencing quality and inclusive education overall. This is a very important webinar series, and important in the sense that we know that within the COVID-19 situation, students are displaced all over the globe. Statistics speaks to about 1.5 billion students and their families who have been significantly affected by school closures caused by the COVID-19 outbreak. And we know that governments have been responding widely by holding remote classes, going online, making sure that there is that provision to ensure that students continue to study. But even against this, we are aware that many of these measures do not necessarily address the issues and disruptions for students who have special needs and varying abilities. And so in this webinar entitled Ensuring Continuity of Learners for Children and Adolescents with Disabilities in the Caribbean, from a rights-based strategies and good practices and prospects, we want to make sure that this is given further attention and that these students are supported. Teachers, students, parents are supported in making sure that the students are able to continue their learning, but also to access quality education within the pandemic and after. When we look at the facts, we know that there are, when it comes on to disabilities, that oftentimes low and middle income countries are greatly affected or mainly affected because there is the challenge of managing persons with disabilities as well as managing the economic sphere in which they're operating. We also know that the information is often lacking about how can we best address what are the specific needs that these students and teachers are facing now within the COVID-19 crisis. And if that data is lacking, how can we make sure that the response is meeting the needs of the targeted population? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very special area of concern for many of us. And this is an area for which we oftentimes are aware of, but do not give enough attention to, And so this is something that for many persons, so many families, so many schools and teachers and students, that there are challenges that they have on a day-to-day basis. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this even further. What does this mean in a very real way? Today in this webinar, we'll be looking at, yes, what are the concerns, what are the issues, what are the needs of students with disabilities, what are the measures that Caribbean countries are taking to ensure the inclusion of children and adolescents, what are the inspirations and aspirations and opportunities for distance education and strengthening national education systems within this context, with a focus on children and adolescents with disabilities. Yes, we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at that from an academic perspective. We're going to be looking at that from a technical perspective. But let me go further to say that there is a need to look at that as well from the perspective of the father who has a high functioning and gifted child with autism, who requires consistency and stability, but has changed schools twice in under a year because of challenges with the facilities that are available, but also some of the parents and teachers who see the child as a liability and not as an asset. We have to look at it from through the eyes of the mother, who was featured recently on a television news station in Jamaica, who has had to stop working within this twin health and economic pandemic because she needs to care for her son with ADHD, who is seen as a major challenge for others. We have to look at it through the eyes of the teacher, who is even more frustrated as she has to become an expert in the virtual space with all its complexities and wanting to continue to ensure that she's giving quality education to her students with varying abilities. We also have to look at this from the eyes of the principal, who is concerned about some of her students with hearing impairment because there's no steady Wi-Fi at home, but she's nervous about the additional vulnerabilities or threats of going to neighbors' homes. These are the challenges. And so the objective of our webinar series, our webinar today, is yes, to address the special needs and challenges of students with disabilities, given the COVID-19 related school closure and with the ensuing reopening of school, to hear this from a Caribbean perspective, from a national perspective, from an academic perspective, but also from the voice of the students and the youths as well, who are observers, as well as who are the ones who are directly impacted by the pandemic. Today, we have a suite of very valued and experienced presenters, which I will be introducing in just a few moments. We have Dr. Fariel Khan, who will be representing UNESCO Kingston office. We have Dr. Anicia Geddes, who will be representing the Caribbean Development Bank. Dr. Joan Spencer Hernandez represented the special education in the School of Education, University of the West Indies. Mr. Dale St. Just, Education Officer from St. Lucia. Senator Floyd Morris, CARICOM Rapporteur, and our youth panelists, our youth representatives, Miss Abigail Holmes, representing her high school in Grenada and supported her by her principal, Miss Michelle Brathwaite. And we'll be following up with our question and answer segment, where we will allow our participants, our valid participants, to share and to weigh in on the discussions. We want to thank everyone who has joined us. We want to make sure that we continue to adhere to the time. And we also want to make sure that we leave here with key messages that can really inform us on our way forward as a region, as member states, as a region, and as individuals, as we continue to support inclusive and quality education. At this time, I want to introduce our first presenter, who is Dr. Fariel Khan, the program specialist from the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean. She has served UNESCO for a number of years and has varied experiences, including giving advising on educational reforms, policy and planning over 30 countries worldwide. Dr. Khan has a doctorate in educational administration and social policy from the Harvard University. And she'll be speaking to us about the right to education for persons with disabilities, moving towards inclusion. Thank you, Dr. Khan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Latoya, for introducing the topic and how important and relevant it is for us to be taking on these issues and the rights to education for persons with special needs at this time when we are going through a health pandemic. Do you hear me, Latoya?
Yes, we're hearing you clearly, Dr. Khan. You're good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I would just like to highlight at this time that the right to education and legal instruments and international commitments is highlighted in several normative instruments globally. It is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UNESCO Convention Against the Discrimination in Education, the International CEDAW, and more recently as part of the Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education. However, at this time when we are undergoing this health pandemic, we need to assure that the right needs to be translated into national plans and programs as we face COVID-19. The right to education is dependent upon its effective implementation. And we need to assure that laws are fully implemented and translated into effective policies, programs, and plans at this time. Current plans and programs have largely been insufficient with regard to needs of children and youth vulnerable to marginalization or exclusion. We all know that schools perform many functions, and this is something which the Global Education Monitoring Report team has been highlighting, that schools provide a safe haven, a social arena, and for families with children with special needs, they offer vital one-to-one support. Online learning, by comparison, is simply not up to the task. So what about the right to an education at this time? So of the learners with special needs in the Caribbean, up to 2 to 4% find day-to-day life challenging without assistance. We also know that disability is more prevalent in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. Disability, gender, nationality, ethnicity, poverty, and many other factors affect internet access. And an online-based high-tech approach is not always ideal for creating an inclusive, interactive learning environment. And currently, because of a lack of disaggregated data and information, it is unclear how many students with disabilities are receiving inadequate educational support as a result of COVID-19. So we know that about 7 million students' lives have been significantly affected in the Caribbean due to the school closures due to the COVID-19 outbreak. However, this measure does not address educational discontinuity and disruption for all students. The estimated numbers of affected students does not take into account all those who are marginalized, disadvantaged, or invisible in education systems. And we need to ensure that learners are not left behind during school closures, as well as once the school reopens. But we also recognize that there are certain barriers to education through remote learning practices. And learners with disabilities are often provided with less help and inadequately trained teachers to deal with remote and distance learning. More time and resources are required for learners with disabilities to actively participate in learning. This includes equipment, internet access, and specially designed materials and support. This makes learning more costly for students and their families, especially at times of this pandemic. And learners who are affected negatively by the classroom shutdown are affected in various other ways. They lose access to school meals, to play with their friends, which is equally important for development and learning. And teachers often lack ICT skills and knowledge. They are unprepared to teach online, and they cannot assure that the student engagement, specifically for learners with disabilities, is up to the mark. Currently, there is no available data on special education teachers' digital skills in developing or least developed countries. So the UNESCO Bangkok office provides some resources, and I'm happy to share these with you as we open up our discussion. Um, there are some resources for assessing learners' needs for remote learning, modifying curricula and instructions, implementing project-based learning, and ensuring individualized education programs are possible during this time of COVID. There are also resources for supporting teachers and providing family and caregiver support. So this presentation will be shared with you. I just wanted to share some of these resources with you, and I hope we look forward to an interactive dialogue with all of you today. So Latoya, over to you so that we can listen to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Fariel. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing the resources. We want to move on because we want to make sure that we are managing the time. Thank you so much, Fariel. So we move on now to Dr. Anicia Gale Geddes. And Dr. Geddes is with us representing the CDB. She is a public policy development monitoring and evaluation professional. Her work at the bank includes socioeconomic projects targeting indigenous groups, children, youths, and persons with disabilities. So she is quite on point to share with us today. And she also spearheads the bank's groundbreaking technical assistance for disabilities assessment in 4 countries: Grenada, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. Welcome, Dr. Gale Geddes, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Latoya, can you see my screen?
Seeing your screen and hearing you clearly. Thank you, Doc.
Okay, all right. So good morning again, everyone. So the presentation this morning is really a brief one to look at education inequality, disability, and intersectionality in the Caribbean, kind of painting a picture with context-specific data on what are some of the challenges confronting us. For the Caribbean Development Bank, we employ the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities definition for what constitutes a disability or consists of persons with disabilities, which hones in on the long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. And importantly, this definition places particular attention on the various barriers that in fact hinder effective participation in society equitably and equally with others. So it really focuses on the social construction of exclusion of persons with disabilities. Of note, the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, unlike the past Millennium Development Goals, underscores the importance of inclusive and equitable quality education, and targets and indicators are specified to capture disparities in terms of educational facilities and otherwise according to disability, gender, indigenous people, ethnicity, and other vulnerable populations. So it behoves our borrowing member countries in terms of the Caribbean Development Bank 19 to begin to set in place materials or M&E systems to capture data and disaggregate same by disability status. In the context of the Caribbean, there are 12 of our borrowing member countries that are signatories to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and 2 have accession. 6 of our member countries, Guyana, Bahamas, Jamaica, Cayman Islands, and Antigua and Barbuda, have disability-specific legislation, and 5 countries have disability policies: Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Cayman Islands. With respect to the data that is cited from the World Disability Report, some 15% of the world's population consists of persons with disabilities, but of interest to us is the fact that UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey suggests that in several instances that the prevalence among children is actually exceeding global estimates, such as Suriname 24% and even Jamaica 24% and 16% for Trinidad and Tobago. With respect to disability, it's important to note that there are distinctive differences by type. So the slide that I'm showing now identifies that in the case of Jamaica, for example, that hearing, physical, physical or mobility disability and sight or visual impairment are more prevalent. And this is also the case in Trinidad and Tobago, although it is called differently in terms of how the data is captured here by body movements, moving, mobility, and seeing. So what these two slides indicate is the fact that disabilities, those disabilities that are more visible are those that are likely to be reported and understood in terms of the educational sector, etc. It's also important to know that it's the distinction by disability severity is of importance. So some work has shown, for example, in Jamaica, compared with children versus working age adults, majority of persons with disabilities have mild to moderate disabilities. With respect to access to education in the Caribbean, work from the National Commission on Disability in Guyana, though dated, shows that 42% of persons with disabilities under 16 years of age never attend school. Some work that was done by ECLAC, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, shows that 18% of children with disabilities 5 to 14 years of age were not being educated, compared with 4% of children without disabilities in these 8 countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, etc. When the data is disaggregated at the country level, we saw that in Grenada, children with disabilities were 16 times more likely to be denied access to schooling. And this is 7 times the case in Trinidad and Tobago. The data that I have examined for Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago shows that for the working age population, 15 to 64, persons with disabilities are 10 times less likely to have access to any form of education, compared with 5 times less likely to be without access to education and training in the context of Jamaica. This type of disparity that we're seeing also transmits to certification attained. And so when we look at this slide, we see that 71% of persons with disabilities did not have any form of certification in Trinidad and Tobago, compared with 52% of persons without disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. And in context of Jamaica, 81% of persons with disabilities had no certification at all, compared with approximately 70% of persons without disabilities in Jamaica. So the disparities are quite evident in terms of educational access, high school attended or certification attained, which transmits now to the labor market. So the data that we have from ECLAC now shows that 34% of the working age persons with disabilities were employed, compared to 59% of persons without disabilities. And only 7% of persons with disabilities over 18 were employed in Guyana. When we take a look at this data in terms of labor force participation, there is a difference not only by disability status, but by sex. So in terms of labor force participation for Trinidad and Tobago, 62% of persons without disabilities were participated in the labor market, compared with 31% of persons with disabilities. And a greater proportion of the males were active participants in the labor market, compared with females, 38% and 24% respectively. This trend is also consistent for Jamaica in terms of a higher proportion of persons with disabilities being absent from the labor market, compared with persons without disabilities, as well as a higher proportions of males with and without disabilities were labor force participants. So we see that there are disparities by disability status overall, but also by sex. And of course, this also impacts the cyclical antecedents to poverty and the reinforcing factors. So from the data we have available from CDB's country poverty assessments, we see that households in Dominica and British Virgin Islands, for example, with persons with disabilities have a higher likelihood of being poor. And when we look at this kind of examination of the data of multidimensional poverty in Jamaica, Jamaica as well, we see that having a disabled household member increase the poverty, the probability of being poor. So the purpose of this real presentation is really to underscore that persons with disabilities do not consist of a homogeneous group. They're in fact heterogeneous, and any kind of consideration for provisions for students with disabilities at any level needs to consider the heterogeneous characteristics that differ by type of disability, severity of disability, gender, socioeconomic status, including poverty, the type of education access. So for example, in Jamaica, we see that students who access mainstream learning have higher educational outcomes compared to students with disabilities who attended special schools only. There are differences by urban, rural location. And if we think of Guyana, Belize, and so on, we would recognize that the hinterland areas have less access to internet and connectivity, and their impacts that would be overlaid compared with a female student with a disability from rural areas from a poor household. And of course, there are other considerations such as ethnicity, bringing to bear, for example, indigenous peoples, their needs, belongers, non-belongers in terms of immigrant, non-immigrant communities, and English as a second language. And even for the deaf, that I call, they face a trilingual reality where there's this formal language, if you consider the context of, say, Lucia, for example, English language, then there's a Creole, and then there's sign language. So they have to contend with 3 languages. And so if they're from a household where parents are hearing, and now they are having to support their students with online learning, and they are not even fluent in sign language interpretation, we can see the 3 levels of barriers. So in closing, I want to say that we have to underscore the intersecting and overlapping identities of students with disabilities, and recognize that there's intensification of individual and household vulnerabilities, and the need for reasonable accommodation and least restrictive provisions have to be done in context of these heterogeneous needs. And of course, twin mental health and social safety nets are necessary to augment resilience. We hope that from our ongoing disability assessment work in these 4 countries, Grenada, St. Lucia, Jamaica, and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, that we will learn more. And of course, you learn a lot more about some of the information that we have gleaned from participation in a June 3rd consultation session on ways of moving forward learning support or learning continuation for students with special needs that Dr. Hernandez assisted in facilitating with CDB and CARICOM recently. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gail Geddes. Thank you so much, and for just bringing our attention to the need to consider the provisions when we consider provisions for this population, to think about the wide spectrum disparities that occur at the geographical, the typology of the disability, and all the other considerations that must be taken when planning and meeting the needs of this population. Thank you so much. We move now to Dr. Joan Spencer Hernandez, who is the head of the Joint Board of Teacher Education and a lecturer in special education in the School of Education at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Dr. Hernandez has served as the executive director of the Learning Center, the Jamaican Association for Children with Disabilities. And she is a trained teacher, so she has that perspective as well, with experience in varying exceptionalities in reading and learning, as well as educational psychology. So we welcome you, Dr. Hernandez, and we are looking forward to your presentation as you examine strategies and recommendations for using insights for persons with disabilities and varying abilities within the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you so much. Dr. Hernandez, I want to ask, your mic is still muted, I know.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. The time is very limited, and so we're in the process right now, having had one of these meetings where we had persons from throughout the Caribbean in education. We met and we went into our groups and discussed how we would go about working with students with special needs come September, and just to continue what is happening for them now, because school has not officially ended. So I'm going to share with you the framework used, because we don't have enough time to go through all the recommendations and so on, and I'm still putting it together. So I'm going to briefly share that with you, but it's important for us to understand the concept behind it. So let me get the PowerPoint presentation, share screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez. And we're really looking forward to that. And we do understand the time limitations.
Right.
And we thank you too. As you bring up your screen, we want to thank you, say special thanks to all our participants who are listening in using the Zoom as well as on YouTube. We want to welcome you. Thank you for being a part of this webinar. Dr. Hernandez, over to you. We're seeing your presentation. Thank you.
Good, thanks. So we did a draft framework, plan of action, and let me walk you through what we did. We looked at it from 3 different levels. So we have 3 audiences. Planning at the planning and policy level, we had specific recommendations regarding to, you know, the ministries of education, some of what they should be thinking about. And because they are the policy persons, we can't write policy and guidelines. At the school level, to include preschool, primary, and secondary, and at the community level. So we had some recommendations for community members because they're an integral part of the teaching and learning process, the whole school, community, school family. And we looked at it when we looked at the data, we found that most of the ideas they're centered around 7 main areas: key policy guidelines and monitoring. Yes, and that refers to the promotion of safety, efficiency, risk reduction, curricular modifications, especially in special needs. What adaptations should we be making? And these policy decisions would be mandatory. So that's aimed primarily at our ministries of education, Ministry of Health, and so on. School operations, we're looking at operations which relate to the management of resources to ensure a safe, caring, and effective teaching and learning environment. Yes. Communication, consultations, and coordination. This is a key component where we're looking, how do we communicate? As it is now, many parents and members of community and so on are very upset. Hold on, let me get this phone off. Sorry about that. And let me turn it.
That's all right, Dr. Hernandez. We do appreciate it. Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, so it's no. Oh, thank you. So communication, consultations, and coordination. Extremely important, otherwise things fall apart. We're hearing complaints already. Oh, we're not a part of the decision. We have our children, their needs are not being met, and nobody's saying anything to us. This top-down kind of thing will just not work. We have to fix that. Assessment of learning needs, extremely important, because when you think about it, we're going to see some widening of the gaps as the children stay home. Some have access, some don't, and there will be some differences, some gains for students because remember now, when we're talking about exceptional needs, special needs, we also have the gifted and talented among that group who must also be catered to. So we're looking at the magnitude of the impact of the closing of schools since March on the performance. We don't know what it is, so we have to come up with ways of establishing that before we go ahead and teach come September. Then we have, human resource. We need to look at if we are reducing class size and we need more persons to interact with the children, more teachers' aides. How do we go about doing this? Is it that we do a shift system? So several recommendations came about where that is concerned. We'll move on to that shortly. Infrastructure, what changes do we need to make it safe, to make spaces suitable for learning while respecting the whole matter of health concerns and so on. Resource management, what are the finances necessarily needed that are quite necessary at this point to make sure what we're trying to do, that it works. And we had some guiding questions. So on the school operations, we're looking at class size, and I can share with you quickly. Most of our special classes are within the 1:15, 1:20 ratio. So where that doesn't happen, we have to get it to 1:15. And there were suggestions about that. How do we do that in terms of when it is more than the 1 to 15? Do we, suggestions came in as to a sort of a shift system, or not a full shift system, but a staggered shift system. Ways and means, because the primary thing is that the children must be safe. We have to respect what the Ministry of Health is saying, right? We looked at transportation. How do we mobilize persons who transport our children to school to ensure that they're safe, they're healthy, and especially some of our students with special needs who may in fact have underlying issues, such as, for example, in Jamaica, and I dare say throughout the region, we have a very high rate of asthma. Yes, and some of our children are pretty much at risk. We have children with diabetes, hypertension, yes. And so we have to look at those situations as some schools are currently in the pickup mode, they do help. So recommendations came in as to how to do it safely, because they are not going to be fitted in very readily with the kind of transport system that we have within the region, with this, packing up of the buses and so on, even though regulation has cut back on that, but that is to be seen fully. How do we help our children to not share their items? We will have to ensure that we have enough, and of course that has implications for financing. Modification of the curriculum, what curriculum adaptations? Many suggestions came in that we focus mainly on the core subjects, math, language arts, and to a lesser extent, science, social studies, and so on. Not necessarily to shortchange our students, but to ensure that the basic literacy and numeracy skills, that those are not lost during this long lockdown period that we have had. Blended and in-person distant learning, among others, that's happening, where we're looking at how do we blend. We would have to audit, find out how many children can actually stay home and benefit from the online learning, and to what extent are we going to engage them, especially when some of our children do not have care providers at home, but need to be in a structured school setting. So recommendations came about where we're saying, look, we will have to probably stagger the day. We cannot be so heavily dependent on online learning for our special needs population. So we want to stagger school opening. We looked at scheduling the day, days on, days off, when some children may actually be at home and benefiting from online, and others, and it's exchange. So we're looking at a flexible approach. Which students, which schools, which areas of the country get priority? We're saying at this point in time, most of our persons who deliberated on this said, we cannot leave any of our special needs students behind. So we're looking at not only those who are in special schools, but students who are integrated in our regular school system, and they represent the largest group of special needs children. As my colleague said prior, we have a very heterogeneous group of children. So we have the dyslexic children, children who are slow learners and so on, who are in our schools, and they are integrated. How do we reach them? And they would have to be a group that we think of as a priority group, right? Assessment of learning, we have instruments. We're going to do a collection of ones that especially speak to our Caribbean students. We have developed some instruments through the CAL program that we're going to make available that will assess reading, language arts, mathematics, and also behavior. We have a behavior checklist that was normed on children in the region, so we will be making that available. What are the key policies, guidelines, and monitoring mechanisms? And that's group 2. They looked at that, guidelines and policies. And here they're looking at guidelines regarding to hygiene, social distancing, physical infrastructure, scheduling. And you know what is wonderful about this COVID era? And I use the term wonderful meaning a lot of what we were supposed to be doing in the past, we're now being forced to do it. We're now being forced to look at how we deal with the physical infrastructure for our children with special needs. And so because we have to enforce social distances, because we have to do it for regular ed, we are forced to do it. And I'm happy about that because right away, schools are making changes, ensuring that ramps are there, ensuring that the children are able to access the classrooms, scheduling and staffing. We're doing an inventory of the staff that we presently have and who do we need and how do we get them. Food and other services, transportation, health and behavior. These policies are within the ministries of education and health, and we're asking for a collaboration between the two ministries in particular, because as it is right now, for example, in Jamaica, Ministry of Health is going around to our schools, busily trying to hold the schools to standard, and they have not collaborated yet with the Ministry of Education to see if funds have been made available for the schools to be making these modifications. But they're going ahead. They're doing as much as they can. How do we go about monitoring what is happening? Ministry, PTA, recommendations coming in for PTA to help with monitoring, so they also have to understand and be a part of the planning and implementation. We need data. We need data on where our children are, who they are, what are their needs, and so we're asking that these be compiled, things we should have done a long time ago. What additional resources do we need? We have to document that, and schools are being asked to do that as we speak. What assistive devices, technologies will be required to enhance and enrich teaching and learning? So again, our various therapists or speech and language pathologists or physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and so on, they have to now say what their needs are based on what their inventory is saying to them right now. Group 3, human resource. What training programs, and we're collaborating with various agencies to ensure that our teachers are trained to use the online platform, to ensure that when you're engaging students with special needs, it is not necessarily the same way as you would do it for regular ed, but in most cases it will be the same because they have similar needs. But how do you modify, right? Communication, technology support, what do we need? So it's an inventory. We want to be driven by data and not necessarily by how we feel about something. When will the training programs begin? We're saying September. What additional staffing? Currently, the various ministries are looking into that to see what do we need, how do we access them, and how do we train? What considerations must be given for support for parents, caregivers? They are part of the mix and the very community in which the schools operate. How do we pull from those communities skills sets and mindsets that are able to assist us within the school, and so on? Infrastructure. And finally, group 4 looked at the communication, consultations, and coordination, which here again, I told you this was the biggest one. Who should coordinate, mobilize? We're saying the ministry, the schools, and the parents through the PTA, through the linkages with the community. Who should participate and be consulted? Every single stakeholder, NGOs, the community-based organizations, the ministries that are responsible for young people. What methodologies should be used to disseminate information to all stakeholders? We're living in an era right now where we're not short of technology and methodologies that we can use. We have WhatsApp, we have Zoom, we have all kinds. So we have plethora available. What education program will be put in place to reassure? That's a big word that was used. How do we reassure all stakeholders about their personal safety and health? And recommendations came in terms of town hall meetings, to plan, to get everybody involved. So we have buying in. Important. If we don't have buying in, we won't have success. I raced through that. Thank you so much. And one of the things before I go is to say we have to recognize that this is an extremely difficult circumstances, and that unavoidably the choices that we will have to be made will be far from ideal, but we're doing our best. Yes, rather than to give one advice, present options. We want variation. So we can look at how does St. Lucia, given their context, how do you do this? Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, right? So we're not saying one size fits all. We have to contextualize what we're recommending. Whenever
Yeah.
advice has to be somewhat generic or self-evident, recognize limitations and point out that this will demand creativity from those who will have to act on that advice. We have to be creative, and Caribbean people are the most creative people I know. I'm part of it. We everything. My husband says I am a hoarder, and I hoard because all these things can do something. They can make a teaching aid.
Dr. Hernandez, I
Only
think you are hitting the nail on the head. I mean, you are speaking about just what needs to happen, the guidelines, the policies, the protocols, the considerations, who needs to be a part, the stakeholders that need to be a part of it. We really want to, we're thanking you so much. Thank you so much for sharing.
That's all right. For racing through, I felt like you said boat just now.
Yes, so I thank you, and I hear your passion, and I really want to thank you. And you know, and even as you you share that, you know, I'm seeing that remaining humble, you know, recognizing that no one has the answers, and so we're so grateful for your presentation, Doc. We're so grateful.
Thank you, Mark. You're welcome.
So much, and please just, I'm sure there are several questions that are coming in. We're seeing them in the question and answer. We're seeing them in the chat as well among our presenters. So we thank you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you more. At this time, we would like to invite Senator Dr. Floyd Morris, who is the director for the Center for Disability Studies at the University of the West Indies. He has hosted a radio show, Seen from a Different Perspective. He was a 2012 recipient of the Prime Minister's Lifetime Award for Excellence in Disability Reform, and among other awards that he has received. And in 2018, he was appointed as CARICOM's Special Rapporteur on Disabilities. Dr. Morris, we welcome you, and we welcome your perspectives and your way in on this conversation. Thank you. As Dr. Morris is coming on, I know I'm going to ask our technical staff to unmute Dr. Morris. Again, we are so grateful for all our participants who are on board. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Morris, you're on.
You're hearing me, and you are seeing me on your screen?
Not yet, but we're hearing you loud and clear, so we want to see you now. There you go.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, and I'm very much grateful for the opportunity to participate and share some perspectives on this very important subject of inclusive education and preparing for getting our children with disabilities in the education system during the COVID environment. I must start out by indicating I'm not using a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to be sharing some perspective because we're coming fresh out of a conference that we managed just to sneak in before COVID entered in the Caribbean. Our Regional Disability Studies Conference was held in March 10th and 11th. And the subject for discussion then was inclusive education, the key for social transformation. So the topic is very much fresh and alive in terms of dialogue in the academic space within the Caribbean, and certainly in the University of the West Indies. And as I listened to the previous presenter, a number of things came to mind that I will zero in on in my presentation. But just to start by indicating that when we talk about inclusive education, we're talking about a mechanism whereby persons with disabilities are required to learn within the same space as individuals without a disability. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in particular, Article 24, regard inclusive education as the modern means of educating persons with disabilities. Yes, it recognizes that persons with disabilities, there are severe types of disabilities, and in those cases, special education is going to be required. But as far as practicable, we are expecting that persons with disabilities would be included in the normal and regular educational institution. And then in that context, we are expecting that these institutions must have certain features to accommodate the learning of persons with disabilities. We're talking about ensuring that the physical plans accessible, that a child who has a physical disability and uses a wheelchair can navigate the physical space without any major encumbrance, to ensure that the educational institution is equipped with modern technology to assist in the learning experience of these children with disabilities, to ensure that there are professionals within the classroom to assist with the education of these individuals, and to ensure that teachers who are going to be delivering the content are able to relate to persons with disabilities. And if it is that I'm to ask the question, how many schools within the educational architecture within the Caribbean are equipped with that sort of infrastructure? I would say very few, very, very few of those institutions have these accessible features for persons with disabilities. And you only want to look at the data throughout the region, which is pointing to the level of poverty amongst persons with disabilities. And that is connected to the fact that our educational institutions are inaccessible by and large to persons with disabilities. And so they are unable to get the sort of education. I was looking at some data yesterday, which is estimating that 7 out of every 10 person with disability between up to the age of 18 in the region are not able to access the educational institution. And when I look at the local situation in Jamaica, it is mirroring that sort of data projection, because we have very few persons with disabilities that we have identified, and I'm going to use that word, identified, in the education system. The previous presenter made mention that there's a whole lot of persons with disabilities in the education system. And yes, it is that they are there, but how many of them have been identified? Because if they are not identified to be given specific treatment and attention, then they are going to pass through the educational system unattended. And what we are going to see is the sort of antisocial behavior taking place in the society, because we weren't able to identify and treat with these individuals. So there are some fundamental issues that have to be addressed in order to deal with the situation of persons with disabilities in the education system in the region. I just want to point out as well that, you know, if it is that persons with disabilities' lives are going to be transformed, education has to be the fundamental pillar that we are going to use to transform their lives. It is what it is we are needed, is needed to change the attitudes, the negative attitudes and stigma that are out there within the society towards these individuals. And so it is imperative that these individuals are in the same learning environment as their non-disabled counterpart, so that these individuals can understand that persons with disabilities do have the capacity to operate, do have the capacity to function, and can think and function as normal and logical as they are able to do. And so we have to make sure that in whatsoever plans we are making for the future of education for persons with disabilities, all of these considerations are made. Now, I go to a lot of conferences and I hear the passion and I see the effort of individuals and the zeal and enthusiasm from these individuals where wanting to get persons with disabilities in the educational space. But when it comes down to the actual implementation, we have a serious problem. I take, for example, a couple of years ago, I did a survey among 100 primary and high schools in Jamaica, which showed about 23% of these institutions being accessible to persons with disabilities.
Yes.
And I have been writing about and pushing this sort of transformation effort in the education system. And in the parliament in 2018, we got the government to accept that there needs to be some urgent attention to making schools accessible. And in that regard, Labor Day 2018 was treated as a starting point for the transformation to make the schools accessible. But
Yes.
to date, we have not seen that sort of push from 2018 to make these educational institutions accessible. And that is something that we need to deal with urgently, because if it is not dealt with urgently, we are going to continue to see the large numbers of persons with disabilities being isolated and excluded from the education system within the broader Caribbean. And
yes, sir, that is on point. And that is the reason why we are so grateful, you know, to have you here today, to share with us, the work that you have been doing, to share with us from your own perspective, your own personal perspective as well. And so we really want to continue this conversation, you know, around how Caribbean countries need to implement, not just plan, as you say, but to implement measures to truly make a difference. We want.
Absolutely. And just the final point that I want to make is the whole issue of training and equipping the teachers to deal with persons with disabilities in the classroom. That is absolutely critical. We have to make sure that going into the teacher training colleges, all the teachers, not just some of them, but all of them must get some form of exposure in terms of identifying and dealing with a person with a disability in the education system.
Agreed, and very, very critical point, Senator Morris. Thank you so much. We look forward to further conversation as we open up the question and answer segment. Thank you, Senator Morris. Thank you for coming and sharing with us.
A pleasure, the pleasure.
Thank you. Now we will have, we will be looking at a case, the case from St. Lucia. We'll be hearing from Mr. Dale St. Just, who is the education officer with responsibility for special education. He's a trained teacher. He has a background in speech and language therapy, and he has been engaged in special education for over 16 years. Welcome, Dale. We want to hear what's happening on the ground. We want to hear more so about some of the challenges, but more so around what are the strategies being employed to make sure that this population is fully being addressed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Latoya. Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping that you can hear me clearly. You can. All right. Very good. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope I do this right.
That's fine, Dale. Thank you so much. And even as you're bringing up your, oh, it's coming up. Even as you're bringing up your screen, we want to thank our presenters. Please, my apology, as sometimes I know that there's so much to share. Dale, is your screen coming up? Is that fine? It's happening on your end?
It is. Can you see it?
Not just yet, but we fully understand the technology as well. So we thanks to our presenters. Oh, here we are. And
all right.
The time as we try to redeem the time. Thank you so much.
Yes.
We're seeing it.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a kind of a excellent. I'm going to do a kind of a quick and dirty look at the St. Lucia experience with learning for children and adolescents with special needs in the COVID environment.
Okay. I'm just asking you if you could kindly put it on slideshow, run it as a slideshow. Slideshow.
Okay.
Yes. And present.
Is that good? Can you see it now?
We're seeing it, but we're not seeing it in presentation. Ah, here you go. Right. Excellent. Thank you, Dale. Go ahead. That's
okay. All right, good. So just a quick look at the landscape of special education in St. Lucia. We have 5 special education centers that cater to approximately 400 students with varying disabilities. In addition to that, we have special educational needs teachers within the mainstream settings, both primary and secondary schools, serving students identified with special needs, but who are deemed to be able to continue their educational journey within the mainstream. In addition to that, for students with vision impairment in particular, they are fully integrated into mainstream schools, but supported by itinerant teachers. So that's a kind of a quick view of special education in St. Lucia. With respect to how we have been affected by COVID, I think St. Lucia has been very fortunate. To date, and that is up to the 14th of June, we have had a total of 19 positive cases in St. Lucia, and 18 of these have recovered. And thankfully, we have had no deaths. So one of the things that this says is that we have had very little community spread. Most of these cases have been imported, and people who have had contact with those persons from overseas. So we are really hoping that it stays this way and that we have no further community spread. With respect to support for students in this learning environment, many of our teachers and schools supporting students with special needs have provided learning packages for students. And in many cases, they operate on a 2-week cycle. So we're talking about worksheets and printed material that are made available to students. In some cases, the parents come to pick it up. There are cases where parents have challenges and the schools make an effort to deliver them to the students. The modes of instruction for online learning has included some of the typical platforms. Zoom has been used, Google Classroom, and WhatsApp is a favorite in the system. With regard to support for parents, and we're realizing that there's a need to give support to parents. Teachers in every case that I have investigated have established communication links, especially using WhatsApp, with parents. And so there's regular dialogue between students and teachers concerning the support needs for children. In fact, I've had word from some teachers who have indicated that they have purchased SIM cards dedicated for communication with parents in this setting. Maybe some of them do not want to share their private telephone numbers, but that's another matter altogether. But they have made the effort to establish communication links with parents, seeing that students are being served at a distance. It was mentioned earlier on, many families depend very heavily on the school feeding program that the Department of Education hosts. And because of that, there is a need to continue giving some measure of support to the welfare needs of these students, particularly those affected by unemployment as a result of national shutdowns and reduction of business activities. So a lot of the supplies that would have been provided to the schools have been packaged and distributed to the homes of needy students. The Department of Education has supported in many different ways. One of the methods is that they have secured a set of MiFi devices that would allow students to have connectivity. We have a number of cases where there is a device in the home, but they have no internet connectivity. So these devices will allow these homes to have about 3 months of freely available internet access. And so they can access the learning platforms, the work assignments, and so on that are provided by the school. And we have given guidance and troubleshooting support to principals and teachers. It's amazing how many new things have popped up as a result of COVID-19. And as I've said to my teachers and principals, we are seeing these as opportunities to accomplish things that we probably wanted to accomplish all along, but did not have the space to do so. Some of the challenges that have emerged for us is that, and I think everybody is saying the same thing, limited access to electronic devices as well as online connectivity. And in addition to that, we are finding that parents who are supposed to be available to support their children, that is a bit of a challenge because some parents are now employed and not able to be physically available during the day. In addition to that, we have some parents who are available but have difficulty giving the support because they lack the capacity to do so. So in a number of cases, we have children with special needs who also have parents with special needs. So there's a bit of a difficulty in terms of their capacity to give the relevant support. Some students we have not been able to contact. The number is very small, but some students for some reason have not been available and we have not been able to reach them. There is the issue of childcare for parents who are working, and for children who have more severe disabilities with unemployed parents, you have a situation of a need for some kind of a respite for these parents because they are with these children 24 hours a day as opposed to getting support from being physically in school when school was on. Other challenges include difficulty helping some students to adapt to the new learning environment. Many students with autism, for example, have difficulty adjusting to the change. And there are some students also with particular therapeutic intervention needs, and the home simply does not have the expertise or the equipment that can provide that kind of support and intervention for these students. I want to see, again, COVID as a potential benefit. And what we have seen is that we have had more regular contact between teachers and parents than ever before. So we are very excited about that, and we definitely want to keep that component of it.
Yeah.
Parents are communicating that they are now more empathetic to teachers and their concerns because they have been involved in the learning activities and they understand now the difficulties. There is a greater embrace of ICT in education for teachers, and the teachers are showing that they have improved in their knowledge, in their capacity to handle that technology in education. But we believe that there's a need for, number one, more equipment in school, and secondly, a greater infusion of ICT in teacher training so that we can have a more deliberate inclusion of that in the teaching space. And then finally, we want to encourage managers in education to create the space for that kind of innovation so that teachers can use these technologies in new ways. And we want to encourage the continuation of that partnership between homes and schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale. Thank you so much for sharing what has been happening in St. Lucia. We concur with you that there are benefits to be gained from this experience, this COVID-19 experience as well, and we can leverage those. At this point, we will be introducing our youth presenters. As I said to our earlier when we started this webinar, that we have a robust group of presenters, and we also have a youth panelist. Her name is Miss Abigail Holmes. And Abigail is a 16-year-old student at the Anglican High School in Grenada. She is in 5th form, and so she's sitting CSEC exams. She loves art and design. I just want to tell you a little bit about her. And her plan is to become an entrepreneur in the area of art and design, and also a counseling psychologist. So Abigail, we welcome you. She's supported by her teacher, principal, Miss Michelle Brathwaite. Abigail has a hearing impairment, and so we're really happy to have her on board and to hear from her what her concerns or her questions and recommendations are. Welcome, Abigail.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As a student, one challenge I faced during COVID-19 is one, being inconsistent in terms of taking some time in the day to study or practice my CSEC questions. However, I believe it is because of no motivation and also distraction at home. Recommendations: 1, a program or a session is provided where a teacher can give a pep talk, that is, finding ways to keep us children motivated. Second, a schedule with planned events or activities will have a direct impact on the student. Specifically, an activity that will require physical involvement and developing skills. Thank you. Question, what can be done toward the Caribbean to break down the attitude of people towards persons with special needs? 2, how do you understand inclusion of students with special needs in the classroom post-COVID-19?
Thank you so much, Abigail. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you, Principal, for supporting Abigail as well. Thank you for sharing with us your questions. Thank you for sharing with us your experiences as well as it relates to managing the distractions, right? And that is something that we know as across the population for students all over who are now within the online space more so than usual. So, and we note your questions, Abigail. We thank you for sharing with us the challenges that you have experienced, and we also are looking forward to our presenters responding to some of the questions that you have posed. At this time, thank you, Abigail.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No problem.
Thank you, Principal, for facilitating this. At this time, we would like to invite, as we go into our question and answer segment, we are quite aware of the time, but let me just say that it has just been so much, such a rich discussion and rich presentations. At this point, we want to invite, select some of our panelists, some of our participants who will be posing questions to our panelists. And the first one being her name is Miss Mauricia Brown, our CARICOM Youth Ambassador, and she is with us. She has a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in international affairs, and she's a track and field star in her own right. And she has a question that she'll be posing to one of our panelists. We also want to hear from our panelists a response to Abigail's question as well. Mauricia?
Hi, everyone. So thank you for that, Latoya. Thank you. You can hear me well, right?
Loud and clear. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for all the presentations that, for all the presenters. I enjoyed what I heard, and I have two questions. And one is for Dr. Anicia, and the other is for Dr. Gail, and the other is for Dr. Spencer Hernandez. The first one for Dr. Anicia. We have a situation here where electronic tablets were given to parents for students. So the government provided tablets not too long ago for all students, not just students who has special needs, but all students. And some parents took and some parents didn't. But in the case of those who took and even those who didn't take, apparently some households, of course, lack internet service, and even a small few even lack electricity. So I'm wondering, I'm not saying that the government can't afford what I'm about to ask, but I'm wondering if there's anything on the CDB's end, if what they can do to help provide access, the internet access, and even electricity access for those who do not have. Because I think it was, who was it that said it? I think it was Dr. Spencer who said, COVID is forcing all of us to become tech savvy. And I think it was Mr. St. Just who said that they have MiFi in St. Lucia. I don't know if they have it here in St. Kitts. If it was the case, and I think I would have already heard it, but is there any way that the city can assist, at least our situation, in providing internet access for those individuals, at least for 3 months, in any case that something like this happens again. And my second question to Dr. Spencer Hernandez is, I think we have 3 to 4 centers here in St. Kitts and Nevis that are for persons with needs. And I spoke to the director of the Cotton Thomas Comprehensive School, and it's a school for about 120 persons. And he said to me that one issue that they have with students is the fact that they have some of them have a self-esteem, issue, and they don't feel included. And so to me, that means that part of their development, their academic development, means having that emotional support where their self-esteem is, boosted. Are there any programs that can help train parents to provide this support? It might sound strange because you would think that parents who have a child with special needs would know how to provide this support, but apparently from the director, sometimes, this self-esteem issue stems from the parents to begin with. So I'm wondering if there are any training programs that parents can attend so that they can, provide this, because trying to teach a child or student, anyone at all with special needs is one thing, but if their self-esteem is not there, then it's like another uphill battle. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mauricia. Thank you so much. I think your first question was to Dr. Gail Geddes, and your second question, Mauricia, was it to Dr. Hernandez?
Spencer Hernandez, yes.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Geddes, over to you. Thank you, Mauricia.
No problem.
Hi, good morning, Mauricia. Thanks for that very good question. It's a searching one with respect to how governments are able to respond. CDB works directly with our borrowing member countries with respect to the provision of resources in terms of loans and grants. So in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, the focal points for the governments are usually the ministries of finance. So CDB is working in terms of two modalities now with our borrowing member countries. In terms of one, we have existing education projects in a number of countries. And so there can be discussions between the bank and the CDB to repurpose existing resources to respond to current COVID-related needs. So that work with respect to the bank and member countries is ongoing. So in terms of how the bank can respond directly, that would be the route. The ministries of education working closely with the ministries of finance for that dialogue with the bank to see how we can repurpose existing resources. The bank also has additional resources that are available to our member countries that are set aside for COVID response for COVID specifically. So there are two options that are available on the table now for our BMCs, but certainly the discussion would have to be held with the Ministries of Education and the Ministry of Finance with the Caribbean Development Bank. So the bank is open for business to support our BMCs in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gail Hernandez. Dr. Gail Geddes. Over to you, Dr. Spencer Hernandez.
Okay, thanks for the question. Self-esteem will be a major issue among our students and even those whom we did not classify as having special needs prior to this. With the stay-at-home regime and parents not understanding them and they not understand their parents, all kinds of issues have come about. If, however, a parent has had a child with special needs for some time, within your own country, there would be systems in place. Certainly, if the particular special need is identified at birth, you're going to find that the Ministry of Health would have had some amount of interaction with that parent and would have shared with them what the expectations are and how they should manage and so on. There are other agencies such as social welfare, any ministry that deals with social welfare, any ministry that deals with, apart from education, that deals with the bringing up of that child to manage the behaviors and so on, should be involved to provide emotional support and for parents to understand what is happening to the child at the different stages of development. Because remember now, our special needs population would go through the same kinds of developmental issues in the early years and then the teenage years and early adulthood and so on. So programs for parent training would be primarily in housed in the various ministries alongside the special education unit that I know your country has. I've been there and I know they have a unit that is particularly empowered to deal with special needs, students with special needs. So I would say, especially during this period, we need to activate these, not just the physical, the infrastructure, the various things that we spoke about, but how do we deal with the emotional self is extremely important. So parents, caregivers, teachers, even, because their temperature gauge has been heightened. And
Yes.
so they also have to, or we, let me put myself in, we have to be refreshed in terms of how do we handle, because the children seem a little bit more antsy now and a little bit more, the social distancing thing. I went to a school last Wednesday where I volunteered to do some teaching, and the boys, it's an all boys school, so they were nicely spread apart, 6 feet and so on, and the chairs were well established, and there's a big old X that says where this chair should be, and everything is in there. And the minute the teachers' backs were turned, they pulled the chairs back together and they huddled and they chat. And I went back in and I said, "What is happening, guys? Mrs. Long time we don't see each other, we haven't seen each other." And they think that's the only way they can talk, to huddle. So, and these are big.
Yes, No, agree with what you're saying. These are real issues. These are real issues and policies and protocols even set in place. We have to, the teachers, the students, the parents have to be manning this on the ground. Thank you so much, Joan.
Yes,
Thank you
definitely.
so much, Joan. I want to bring us back to the question posed by Abigail, our youth rep, who said, what can be done? I'm posing this to you, Senator Morris, about what can be done throughout the Caribbean to break down the attitudes of people towards persons with special needs. This is a weighted question. Senator Morris, we're asking for your pointed response on this. I know this is a weighted question. So what can be done to break down the attitude, Senator Morris? I'm going to ask, somebody's mic is open. I'm asking you to kindly close your mic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Senator Morris. Your mic is on. We're going to ask our technical team to unmute Senator Morris as he responds to that question. Other questions that are coming in as well include questions about the loss of learning that has occurred for the entire population, and more so for persons with special needs. What is being done about that? What are the plans around that? So I will throw that question. I'll throw that question back.
You're hearing me now?
Yes, I'm hearing you. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, it's a very important question that has been asked, because you know, a lot of the problems faced by persons with disabilities throughout the region is really because of the attitudinal barriers that exist within society. And, you know, a number of approaches have to be adopted, and it has to start from the home with families, how they treat and relate to persons with disabilities in their own family setting, for them to understand and appreciate the fact that a person with a disability can function and can operate effectively in the society just as anyone else. And you start from the family unit and you move into the educational, the broader society now, where you are going to come into contact with others on a regular basis. So you have to make sure that the children are there in the regular educational institution. And that is why, you know, we push and we support inclusive education as the major means of empowering and transforming the lives of persons with disabilities, and for others within the educational space to understand that persons with disabilities can function as normal as they are able to. And other social institutions such as the church, the media, will have to play a fundamental role in terms of changing these attitudes towards persons with disabilities. And then persons with disabilities who have gone through the society and become successful individuals also will have to assist in the attitudinal change by making sure that they are champions in the public space for persons with disabilities, and to demonstrate to individuals that persons with disabilities can function as normal as anyone else. And that, yes, you know, I will say that, you know, the negative attitude towards persons with disabilities is a social construct. It has come over years of negative socialization, and it is going to take time. And that is why there's also need for a consistent public education program throughout the region to change these negative attitudes. And the public education program can't be a 3-month activity. It has to be a consistent activity that that serve to transform these negative approaches.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Morris. Thank you. We have a question also. I started with that one around the learning loss, the issue of the learning loss And of course, this is an issue for everyone, for all students, the risk of that, given the COVID-19 pandemic, but even more so, how do we address that? And what are the considerations around that for persons with disabilities? We're going to ask Dr. Khan to weigh in on this. Dr. Khan?
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yes. It was crackling. Could you just repeat the questions? And I'm happy to.
No problem. It's really a question of the general challenge that we're having, the learning gaps that have been resulting from the current pandemic.
Yes.
And of course, even more so, this is further heightened with persons with special needs. So we just wanted to hear from you, what are some of the considerations around this? Thank you.
So right, while they are, UNESCO Institute of Statistics is making some efforts to assess the learning gap and in terms of proficiency of learners due to the protracted closures. However, when it comes to learners with special needs, we do not have disaggregated data, and we are still not, we don't have any data that can, tell us how many learners are affected, and what would be the gaps in learning and the loss to learning. However, some of the recommendations that we are making to catch up is there will need to be a catch up phase, because due to also interactivity with teachers and amongst peers, which enables us to learn and absorb our messages and our learning better. We will need to have a catch-up period, and this could be either during the summer months, but it could also be during the next full academic year. So 2020 start when once schools reopen in September. From September till the next summer vacation in June, that whole academic year is going to be taken as a period for catch up.
Okay.
And especially to provide support and teachers will need to be given additional support to prioritize which parts of the curriculum they need to really focus on to help the learners fill that gap. So it's going to be and we are also seeing that peer support amongst learners, where learners are actually working with other their schoolmates and peers. That is actually going to be a very big contributor to helping overcome the learning gaps, and learners need to make support groups where they provide support to each other. It could either through internet and connectivity, or in cases where internet is not available, through practicing social distancing, but in local communities. So I think these learner support groups will also help with the catch up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Khan. We are at the 11:30 mark. I mean, this has been quite an event, so much information, so much to share, so much that can be shared. At this time, we're inviting participants to just stay with us for a few more minutes. We think we would like to wrap up and extend this session by 15 minutes maximum. So we invite you to stay with us for a few more minutes so that we can respond to some of the other questions and recommendations coming from the participants. We have a question here about how can we make sure that there is this movement continues, and I think Dr. Morris really spoke about that. He says looking at different opportunities, engaging multiple stakeholders in the discussions as we go forward. There is also the question about what mechanisms for assessment of learning are in place, and that question I'm going to direct that to Dale to share with us what mechanisms are in place for that. Dale, over to you.
Well, in St. Lucia, the directive that has been given by the Department of Education is simple: no new learning. So
Yes.
From the period when schools have been shut down and learning has transitioned to the various distant platforms, the directive has been given that the learning activities should be remedial in nature, should be revision in nature, because we had to acknowledge that this was so brand new to everyone, and we were not certain if we would be able to get to everyone, and also the possibility that we may not exactly get it right for students with special needs. So the decision was taken by the administrators of our Department of Education that there should be no new learning activity while we're trying to figure this out. Um, so that's what has happened so far. With the when school reopens in September, I guess we'll have to search our brains and to figure out how we are going to engage. But the expectation is that all students will be back in school as of September, and the exact configuration of it is still being decided. There is talk of a shift system and various other modalities. The one thing I do want to say is that there are some beautiful things that have come out of the learning arrangements that we have currently. And we are encouraging schools to keep those things that are working.
Yes.
There are some students from our special schools who have communicated to the teachers and principals that they prefer this than being physically in school.
Ah,
And there must be something about this that is working well for them. So we need to figure out what exactly that is and keep that component of it so that going forward, they can get the best of both worlds.
thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. St. Just. We have a question for Dr. Anisha Gilgedes around financial resources that are available from the CDB. Can you take that one? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Latoya. I just wanted to underscore earlier, I mentioned that the bank can do two things. We have some set aside resources for COVID response, but we also have resources in an ongoing way for the education sector. So we can act in either of two ways. There is opportunity to repurpose existing loan resources in country for COVID responses. We have education specialists that are assigned to different countries. And so a lot of the work has to do with advocacy from educational stakeholders. So that direct conversation would be best held with our education specialists that's assigned to the respective countries. So an email to the bank or otherwise we could be able to guide. So in St. Lucia, for example, as Mr. Sanjus mentioned about what's happening in the country, we would have received a request from the government of St. Lucia to repurpose 50,000 US, for example, to special education needs in context of what is required on the ground. So the bank's education specialists are available to support. I want to underscore as well that because the needs of the sector is multidisciplinary and complex, a lot of the work that is required has to do with advocacy within ministries of education and ministries of finance. So we want to just encourage that the country level dialogue continues so that the subsector needs for special education needs and inclusive learning and students with exceptionalities would be well understood and be documented in terms of the resources that are required. But just to say that the bank is open and is available to support the countries in regards to the needs that would have been identified in our borrowing member countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are seeing comments as well coming from, thank you so much, Anicia. We're seeing comments in the chat as well saying that we need to lobby for legislation to support additional change to ensure that the rights of persons with disabilities are protected. We need to showcase and explore other cultures and to look at what they are doing as well, other cultures, other regions as well. We also, Senator Morris has noted that he has asked the question, why is it that there is such a data sparsity where persons with disabilities are concerned in the region? So Senator Morris, so you are underscoring points that were already raised, that there is a need for evidence, for data to be collected around what's happening as it relates to our population with disabilities. We also see that how we're asked a question from Ecuador, so it's coming across as well, about how the governments can help children and adolescents in a time when there are issues around the coronavirus. So we hope that those questions have been answered. Some of those questions have been answered by our panelists, by our presenters as well. There is also a question around what are the, and it's a big question, it's a weighted question, what's the biggest challenge facing this population? Is it a challenge of, is it an actor issue or is it a structural issue? and so we really want to throw that open to any of our panelists who would want to take that one as we are wrapping up our conversation. Is the challenge, the underlying challenge that is facing persons with disabilities, adolescents, youths, adults, because it's all about lifelong learning and employability as well. Is it a structural issue? Is it an actor issue? Where do we think it really resides and what can be done? I think that's a wonderful question for us to get a 30-second reaction from each of our panelists as we close out. So we'll start with you. Dr. Hernandez. Joan? If not, we will, as Joan comes in, we'll ask Anicia, who just ended, to give her views on that. We're not hearing you, Anicia. You have to unmute. That's fine.
Thank you for pointing that out. I think it's a structural issue, but it's also, because it's a structural issue, I'd like to make 3 suggestions. I think that in order to respond to inclusive and participatory processes, we have to look at 3 levels of analysis. As I mentioned in the presentation before, we have about 14 countries of the region that are either signatories to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or have accession. Now, they're also signatories to CEDAW, to CRC, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Rights of the Child, etc. So there's no shortage of policy commitment in CARICOM, I believe. There's also the Pétionville Declaration from CARICOM, which shows the commitment, but there are limitations in terms of legislative commitment that is enforceable by law that enshrines the right to access of persons with disabilities to equitable and equal access to education. So that ties in with the structure. Providing legislation is one way to address these structural barriers. So when you are in rural areas and a principal tells you, well, the school is inaccessible, and how does a parent have agency and strength to advocate where there are no systems in place? Secondly, again, there's a weak policy framework. So about in 5 of our member countries, there are policies, but what are the systems in place to strengthen programming around, 1, mainstreaming inclusive access, as Dr. Morris identified before, and then what is needed to provide responses targeted to those structural gaps that we see according to different types of disabilities? Are there speech-to-text software that is required for the blind and visual impaired? How many households can afford that with students with disabilities? What's the cost for assessment? Do they have to wait at MicroCare for a year to be assessed and diagnosed? And then when assessment report comes to the fore, what kind of examination and accommodations are put in place programmatically to ensure that not only students with disabilities are mainstreamed to inclusive settings, but that their disability-specific needs are being addressed. So I think it's a structural issue, and we have to address it by legislation, by policy, and by programming in terms of capacity building of our educators, strengthening advocacy among parents and persons with disabilities themselves, who will say to you, nothing about us without us. So I come to this with the lens of an academician. I also come to it as a practical lens of working at the CDB, and even before the CDB, a researcher's perspective. So I would say those 3 levels of action would be required going forward.
Thank you so much, Anicia. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say what my colleague just said, I support. I want to just add the whole matter of monitoring and evaluation, because a bit of research that I did show that most of our countries in the region, not just being signatories, but embedded somewhere in our education act and laws and bylaws, there are instances there where we have spoken directly to special needs and what should happen, but it's not being policed, it's not being implemented, it's not being monitored, it's not being evaluated to check on effectiveness. And until we have that as part of the whole system, and until we are held accountable for what we do for our students with special needs, then we will sit back and relax and say, oh, we have a law, we have something somewhere that says we have it, we did it. So just to endorse all that she said, and to just add that once we have it, those who don't, we need to get it in the law, but then it must be enacted, it must be enforced, it must be monitored, it must be improved, and so on. That's the major thing. So we need some pressure groups to get this going, parents, teachers, whoever, because it's just not happening the way it should.
Thank you so much, Joan. Thank you. Floyd, we're wrapping up, so we're just asking for 1 minute from everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. Floyd, you're still muted, but we'll come back to you, Dale, if you can go, and then we'll come back to Floyd. Oh, Floyd is ready. Floyd.
You have me ready now?
Yes, Floyd.
Okay, I do agree with Dr. Gail Geddes that it is a structural problem, but it's also attitudinal as well. When you have a situation where almost 400 years of colonial rule with schools being constructed in a particular way, and then for the past 60 years, when we in the post-colonial environment, not much effort has been paid to making the educational institutions accessible for persons with disabilities, you're definitely gonna have that entrenched attitudinal environment towards persons with disabilities. And so, I mean, legislative action must play a fundamental role. We have 6 countries in the Caribbean now with legislation. We have to make sure that all the countries within the Caribbean space have legislation to protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. And that is an area that is going to get increasing attention and pressure from the Office of the Special Rapporteur where disability is concerned in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Floyd. We're hearing that, and we're hearing that as a heavy warning. Thank you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dale.
Okay, so Joan mentioned a very important word that I want to piggyback on, and that is accountability. The issue is that people's feet are not held to the fire, and so they get away with murder in terms of the situations and experiences that persons with disabilities realize on a daily basis. I think many of the reasons that, or among the reasons why we do not have legislation, is because people do not want to be locked down, and governments do not want to be locked down to having people demand these things and to be able to quote legislation to say that they have a right to receive supports for persons with special needs. Also within the realm of accountability, we are a data poor region, and if you don't know it, it's difficult to advocate for it, it's difficult to argue for it, it's difficult to insist on getting the supports that we need. The other thing I want to say with respect to accountability is I think we need to give greater exposure to the area of special education and students with special needs and disabilities. It is still too much of a best kept secret, I think, in many places. I am honored to have a child with special needs. And as a parent, we insist on taking her everywhere we go. So she's in church, she's on the beach, she's in the supermarket, she is everywhere that every person has the right and opportunity to be. So I think we need to encourage parents to be a little bit more assertive so that you know, the issue of special needs is not kept back and hidden in a corner, and that people can be held accountable for the supports that they provide for persons with special needs.
Thank you so much, Dale. Thank you. And our last panelist, but by no means least, Abigail. Principal Brathwaite. Anisia, I'm seeing your video open. Yes, okay. I was wondering if you had something that you wanted to add. Abigail, Michelle, Principal Brathwaite, we would want to hear from you one last time.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. And I really appreciate, and I think that you are doing a good job with this presentation. And I really hope in the future that things are better for people who have special needs and have disability. And I think you all are doing a very good job. And I would like that to continue.
Thank you so much, Abigail. All the best on your CSEC exams. And it was a wonderful opportunity for you to be here with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Principal, thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to all our participants on Zoom. Thank you to our participants on YouTube. We thank you to our presenters, our panelists. Special thanks to Dr. Khan. Special thanks to Dr. Gail Geddes. Special thanks to Dr. Spencer Hernandez, Mr. Gail St. Just, representing St. Lucia, Senator Floyd Morrison, our CARICOM rapporteur. We thank you to Miss Abigail Holmes, our high school student from Grenada, and for our panelists also, our participants, sorry, who asked such pointed question, Miss Maricia Brown, also from St. Kitts. Thank you so much. And we want to wrap up by saying that we hear what you have said. We hear the call for legislation. We hear the call for policy and programs that are supported by systematic system change, because that can't happen if it doesn't happen on the ground. It needs to happen on the ground. We hear the call for multi-stakeholder involvement, for advocacy. We hear the call for accountability, right? Policing, policing the system, policing the policies, policing and monitoring and evaluating what is taking place. We hear the call to put pressure, to have pressure groups from our parents. I heard Dale mention about parents being more assertive, teachers being more assertive, the community groups being more assertive as well. We also hear from Abigail the aspirations for a better future. Her experience here, I'm sure, has raised her hope and her expectation that the changes and the support that is needed will come to her and to all our students within the Caribbean with special and varying needs. So we want to thank everyone who was a part of this. We want to thank our technical team, our coordination team from UNESCO Santiago office, to Paola, to Ilanki, to Yayoi, to Dr. Bristol from CARICOM, to all our Secretary Generals, everyone who has been a part of this, who has made this a reality for us. And we want to leave you with what was said, articulated by Dr. Gail Geddes, that nothing for us without us. Nothing for us. This population, very special, very abled population, very abled and very diverse population, is saying nothing for us without us. We want to thank you for being a part of this webinar today. And we look forward to your involvement in our next webinar in the series, which will be happening in 2 weeks. So please save the date. This should be happening, but we will be sending out our invitations. But please save the date for Tuesday, June 30, which is tentative for our next webinar. But put that on your calendars for now. We want, again, I say thank you. It was my pleasure having you, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all.
Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Latoya. Fantastic presentation. I have to rush off because I have another meeting, so we'll catch up. Bye.
Laura, thank you, Abigail. I see you waving out. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Principal Brathwaite. Thank you. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khan.
It has been wonderful.
Thank all our participants. We saw participants from all across the region and beyond. So from within the Caribbean, we saw from Bahamas. I don't want to start calling names as we're closing out because I don't want to get in trouble, but I just want to highlight from Ecuador, from Dakar. We thank you all from Jamaica. We thank you all for being a part of this presentation. St. Kitts, Grenada. We really want to thank you for being a part of the presentation today. You're very welcome. We're seeing in the thank you notes, the thanks to CARICOM and UNESCO. Thank you so much. Very passionate and impactful session. Looking forward to more discussions and actions. Mucha suerte. I hope I said that right. Martha, we see you. Yes. Many thanks and more successes. Yes. Excellent leadership and management of the webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we can end the session.
Yes, we may. And I just want to give a special shout out to another panelist who would have been on board from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He's Kevin Frederick, and he wanted to be a part of the youth presentation, but we thank him for being a part of this, and we look forward to having him as a next time as one of our youth panelists. Thank you so much from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Thank you, Lanky. I think over and out. Thank you.
Okay, Louise. Maybe we can finish. Muchas gracias.